So, how's the volume in the room? Can you all hear me well? Okay. So, given the way you're all dispersed, I grew up Catholic, and so if you go into a church and everybody's spread out, the priest will usually say, "Okay, come on, everybody move in." But you don't have to. If you want to, you can move in so the panel can see you. And it's also clear to me that this must be an open bar. Because I think the cocktail hour is starting or will be starting, so that's why the room is as half full as it is. But let's begin. And I'd like to say good afternoon and thank you for attending what we hope will be an interesting and cutting-edge discussion regarding mining's social impact and mining's contract with society, mining's social responsibility. As we gather, I think, and you know what is a very obvious premise, and that is that stakeholders are increasingly making their decisions based on environmental, social, and governance ESG credentials that have been around a while, but credentials that are more and more important to stakeholder decisions. We know, and the premise is, that investors are favoring businesses with robust ESG frameworks. And governments are increasingly implementing regulations, contemplating regulations to increase transparency, diversity, equal pay, to reduce or eliminate carbon emissions, and to achieve other social ideals. This makes ESG efforts, as you know, crucial to long-term creation and growth. The equally important but less talked about aspect of ESG is what we're here to talk about today, the S. S is not sales, S is society. Today, our erudite panel will focus upon the S in ESG by asking the question, what is the mining industry's contract with society? What is the mining industry's contract with the people in the communities where they work? So let's begin. Jeff Geipel is the Director of Mining Shared Value. Jeff founded Mining Shared Value in 2012. It's a Canadian nonprofit focused on helping the mining sector and related stakeholders to maximize local procurement. Keywords, local procurement, when you listen to Jeff this afternoon. Elaine Dorward-King has over 30 years experience in mining, chemicals, and engineering industries. She is a non-executive director for Sibanye, Stillwater, Kenmare Resources, and NovaGold. Welcome, Elaine. Nikolay Hristov. He is at Dundee Precious Metals, which is a Canadian international gold mining company. I should mention that Elaine and Nikolay are both PhDs, so if you ask questions in a bit, make sure you refer to them as doctor before you address them. We have Lenny-Pessagno from Albemarle. And as you know, her company is the global producer in lithium, the subject of a lot of the panels and discussions today, also producing bromine and catalyst solutions. I want to mention to you that if you have questions about government interaction on the issue of social in ESG, that Lenny's career includes diplomatic assignments in the U.S. embassies in Madrid, in Buenos Aires. She also served in the U.S. consulate in the U.S. Consulate General in Monterrey, Mexico, and in the U.S. Department of Commerce in Washington, D.C.
Right, you forgot Chile and Colombia.
Chile and Colombia. And so when referring to Ellen, you may refer to her as the Honorable. And then last but not least, Osam Iyahen is the Senior Director of the Africa Finance Corporation, AFC, a multilateral financial institution created by African sovereign states, and it finances the development of natural resources in Africa to enhance growth of African states. So that's our panel. And we will begin with a question, a lofty general question of the entire group, but I'll ask maybe Elaine if you could start us off. So have stakeholders' expectations in terms of the S in ESG changed? Are they evolving? Are they becoming more stringent?
Well, certainly, and welcome everybody. It's great to be here today. When I began to think about the contract with society, what mining's contract with society is, I thought not a legalistic contract, but really what's the contract in faith or engagement that we have with the stakeholders that we work with. And the S in terms of social, if you think of that in terms of society and the expectations of society, certainly they have evolved, and they're evolving even faster and faster. And, the mining sector has been integral for a very long time in producing the metals and materials that the world needs for economic development, for opportunity to expand, improve the standard of living, the things that we've talked about for a long time. And now, what I think is a piece of our contract with society is being responsive to the circumstance that we find ourselves in with regard to the need to transition, not incrementally and slowly, but as rapidly as we can, to a low-carbon world. And what the mining industry can do in terms of focusing on those metals and minerals that are key to a low-carbon world. And we've heard a lot about that today. And, the usual, the copper and the nickel, the things that are less common, lithium and some of the other things that are absolutely essential for battery technology, for electric vehicles, for some of the technological innovations and things that we're going to need if we are going to have quickly enough a world that is able to wean itself off of carbon and into a lower carbon world. And so part of our contract then, as mining and metals companies, I think, is to be flexible enough to think about what is our proposition to society in terms of what our business strategy is, what we seek to mine, how do we see that both from a business and economic point of view, and the greater obligation, in fact, that responsible mining companies have to society. And I think you are starting to see that shift in a number of companies in the way that they think about the commodities that they want to be in, and not just what they do, but how we do it. And that is also a key piece of our social contract with society, to make sure that our positive impacts to the communities where we operate outweigh the negative impacts. And certainly, mining can have negative impacts on those that are closest to our operations if we're not very, very careful about how we think about that and how we mitigate those impacts. So, I think the two of the words that I would come up with as we think about the evolving expectations are, one, flexibility. We may have to change, what we're doing, and how we're doing it, and a sense of urgency. I do not see governments leading us to a lower carbon world in the time frame that we need to get there. That is going to come from innovative and creative, responsible capitalism. And the mining industry is an important part of that. And I can give some examples of some of the companies I'm familiar with there, but I think I'll stop and maybe we can save and do that later.
I'd like to jump in there if I could, because you really teed this up beautifully. I'd really like to talk about the example, one of the examples in where we operate in Chile, about changing expectations and how we had to be flexible. And I really think of the three key words with society and community is dialogue, transparency, and shared value. So we've been operating the Salar de Atacama since 1982, producing lithium. And we had a very close relationship with the indigenous community that lives closest to our site, about 30 kilometers away. We have a camp there. And every time there was a need, if they needed money to pipe in their water so it didn't get salts in the process, we would do that. In 2012, we signed a formal agreement with that community where we laid out our common vision for sustainability, for supporting their cultural identity, et cetera, as well as shared value. And then the indigenous communities that live around the Salar, there's 18 of them, knocked on our door and they said, we love what you did with the town of Paine, we want you to include us as well. And so we embarked on a 4-year dialogue about what that would look like. And the crux of it was really that they wanted to ensure that the Salar that they inherited from their grandparents was the same Salar that their grandchildren would inherit. So we signed an agreement in 2016 whereby 3/4 of this voluntary agreement are focused on how we'll work together to ensure the sustainability of the Salar. So if we think about transparency, we have 150 monitoring sites that monitor brine levels and water levels. We monitor those in conjunction with the communities. When we think about dialogue, we meet monthly with them to really talk about what we're doing, understand what their challenges are, and hash out the problems that inevitably arise. And then thirdly, shared value. And so in this voluntary agreement, we're sharing 3.5% of our sales since 2016 with the 18 indigenous communities through 2043. Per the UN Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People, they have self-autonomy, self-determination, and so they determine what they do with these projects. There were many people who said they couldn't manage the money, and guess what? The communities have proven them wrong. They've built community centers, greater access and more efficient access to water, photovoltaic plants, scholarships. I could go on and on and on. And I think even more importantly is that when we sit down and talk about environmental indicators, we're sitting down with peers because the Council of Indigenous Communities and most of the 18 communities have their own environmental advisors. They have their own lawyers and communications people. And so it's really transformed. When you think about developing trust, trust is based on equality. So they know when they sit down at the table from their advisors what they're looking at. So it's been really a great success story for us, and we are really implementing programs such as that, evolving our shared value programs globally as a result of our success in Chile.
Osam, could you maybe pick up on that comment, and thank you. What is the Finance Corporation in Africa doing to identify companies that it wants to invest in, which are committed to and faithful to the social contract?
Thank you, Greg. It's a good question. For us at the AFC, the S is extremely important in the ESG, particularly for Africa, because unlike the West or other parts of, like the West, where you have, where the governance is relatively strong and in place, in Africa it's quite weak. And so because it's quite weak, the S needs to be stronger. And it also helps to, it's one of the reasons we find that because the S is weak, foreign investors don't come to the continent, because there's a lot of strife between communities and investors, and how to manage that is a very key, it's a very important aspect. So for the Africa Finance Corporation, because we are funded by African governments, African private entities, and we are long-term investors in the sector, we're not, Africa is really not an asset play for us. It's actually where we live. It's where we've invested. We see things from a very long-term perspective. So when we are looking at projects and when we're looking at investments, we have to make sure that the project bankability is not defined by the metric of financial returns alone. We have to make sure that the project is able to sustain itself well beyond the years after the investor leaves. And this is a key criteria for us to invest in any project. And if it doesn't meet that threshold in terms of ability for the project, for the indigents of the people of the community to be able to have jobs, transferable jobs, people in the community to have clean water, power, and to be able to pass on the dividends and the benefits from the projects onto the community. These are the key criteria for us to be able to invest in, because we think that this S needs to be strengthened. It's a partnership between the communities and the investors. So, and if it's not seen as a partnership, as a true partnership, we don't think that in the long term you can have a sustainable project, mining project, because that is really, so I think we've seen a lot of that have gone past the, it's now seen as a right to invest in projects. It really belongs to the people as opposed to the investors now. So it has to be a joint partnership, and so that's how we look at our investments. We've invested over $600-700 million in the mining space in the last 8 years, and in a lot of the projects where we invest in, we've provided. The gold project we just invested in recently in Sierra Leone. It's an open cast gold mine. Before we even got the mining license, we had built a school. We had built a school. We built a hospital. We also provide 1% royalties of any future production for the community development. That way we're able to show trust to the community and show that we are there for them. If we got the license, good. If we didn't get the license, good. We'll continue to invest in them because we see this as a true partnership. And that's the type of trust that we think is necessary to be able, at least from the African context, to be able to drive projects to bankability. That's the type of energy that we're bringing into the sector.
That provides an example for the entire industry, and thank you for sharing that.
Thank you.
So Nikolay, what about Dundee's approach to social responsibility and the social contract?
Yeah, thanks, Greg. And I guess we are not that much different to what was shared already with my fellow panelists. We struggled with measuring the S, and I think that's common when you say S. What does it mean actually? Is it how many jobs you have created? And even if you created many jobs, are these jobs benefiting the people who are around the project, and for how long? So we've been looking at finding a mechanism, finding a way how we can measure that in a sort of a more a way that is understandable and transparent, and we can explain. So we've been experimenting with this capitals approach, and just to introduce a little bit more, so when we develop a mining project, we borrow financial capital to get the infrastructure, get the project going. But as a mining industry, we're also borrowing natural capital as well. And as we are returning financial capital and returning on the financial capital, we can do the same on the natural capital as well. Mm-hmm. Similarly, there is the human capital and there is the societal capital. Mm-hmm. And now we're trying to develop a mechanism how through the development of those projects, we are changing those capitals in a way to make it positive after our intervention there. So in a way that we can leave the communities better off once we leave, because we know that all these projects that we are working on, they have a mine life. So we had a lot of examples that after the mine closes, then there is a ghost town left.
Right.
Well, that's not good. So just to give you an illustrative example of what we are doing, so in one of our mines, which is a very short mine life, we committed to develop alternative jobs while we're operating that has nothing to do with the project there. So we're halfway there, and it has been an incredible journey in terms of developing innovative ways of relying on the local entrepreneurship and building that skill and capacity to manage projects like you were sharing long term. And it has been a very successful so far, so looking forward to sharing more.
So, Nikolay, if we just take a minute with this concept of retraining folks as you see the life of the mine close to ending. I've read about what has been described pejoratively as dependence that is established in communities. And it sounds like Dundee has addressed this by a retraining program and a repurposing of human capital. Is that a fair statement?
We are trying. We are trying to avoid this dependence because, again, sort of where you go, you build a school, you build a hospital, you build pretty much everything. You go communities where the mine have delivered everything, and the whole community is dependent on that. We learned that this is not a sustainable way. So we have been experimenting. Okay, what does it mean actually to try to avoid actually building dependency? Right. And what will it take in terms of building the infrastructure, building the skill, in order to empower that community to be successful longer term, to have their livelihood secured in a long way. Obviously, you need to take sort of care for environment as well. That just comes as a non-negotiable.
Excellent, excellent. Jeff, your organization spends a lot of time thinking about and implementing policies related to local procurement. Can you please tell us a little bit about that and how it relates to the social contract and to the items that we've been talking about so far this afternoon?
Great, thank you. It's actually quite funny because I did my grad school here in London, and my dorm was about a 5-minute walk from here. And in my dissertation, we wrote about Canadian, specifically mining CSR, and whether it was relevant for economic development. And that's when it was called CSR. Now it's called ESG. In 5 years, it'll be called something else, but it'll be the same basic thing. And I included, as I was saying, Dundee metals in that dissertation. And what we were looking at, or what, I'm saying we because of my organization, but I at the time, was whether companies were reporting on the S, the local hiring, local procurement. And what I found was that mostly no, they were just focusing on the environment, human rights abuses, sort of not doing harm. All the emphasis was on we're not doing this bad thing, we're not doing this bad thing, but there was very little, generally speaking, across the research about what we're doing on local hiring, on local procurement, on shared infrastructure. And I can say, it's been good to see. Right now, it's a different world. We are seeing this, and I think, for example, Ellen, you were talking about implementing IRMA. I mean, the IRMA standard, for example, grades you on things like local procurement, and it's a public report saying, here's what they're doing on local procurement. So that's far beyond not doing harm. So that's sort of just some context. In terms of how we approach this, we're trying to lock in local procurement into mining company responsible practices and standards, and for that matter, government regulations. When it comes to the S, procurement is the biggest payment made by any mine site in host countries, and so therefore it is really the biggest economic and social development opportunity. So we're trying to find ways to work with companies to implement better practices, to be transparent about that, which is incredibly important, not only from an empowerment of suppliers angle, but also from a trust angle with local communities. And we're doing some on-the-ground projects now in terms of working with Golden Star Resources in Ghana right now on aligning several companies to align their supplier development programs. Mostly what we find is that everyone wants to do local procurement, but there's just not this, there's a lack of coordination problem. Let's say a collective action problem among the companies, even internally between the procurement department and the ESG department, for example. So we're trying to put in place systems across the industry that make these relationships more tangible, make them more automatic, so that we can make local procurement happen as a matter of just standard operating procedure.
As we experience a lack of certain critical minerals, metals, and other commodities, do we run the risk of losing ground in the rush to meet the market demand?
That's a great question, and we've heard a lot about the new resources that need to come online. And I think, and again, I love to speak in examples because I think it's very illustrative. We've got a brownfield site in Kings Mountain, North Carolina. It operated from the 40s to the 80s producing lithium. And then we shut it down as it was much more cost-effective to produce in Chile. Well, today we're in the pre-feasibility stage to bring that mine site back online. There's an operating quarry right next to us, and Kings Mountain is really a mining town. But that said, it's really important to have that early dialogue and bring the community along. And Jeff already mentioned we're really using the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance. We've just completed a third-party audit at our Salar site in Chile. The standard was developed through multi-stakeholders, affected communities, NGOs, unions, and we're using their standards really as our Bible. And so what we're doing is we're having community forums now where we transparently share. These are our most recent environmental studies. Where we transparently share what the mine site is going to look like, what the waste dumps might look like. And then that opens a dialogue to really co-create. And without taking that time, without listening and evolving and adapting our mine site, if you don't do that, you're going to have problems. And I'm not saying we're very early on. And we could end up certainly having problems with the community, but we're going to have that foundation developed through our listening sessions, our community forums, through our info center, through our openness to transparently share data. We're going to have built that trust, and hopefully together can work through those problems. So that cannot be rushed. And I think everyone just needs to realize that. Sure, we need very efficient environmental permitting processes. That doesn't mean you speed up the environmental baseline data gathering, but governments can speed things up by having faster permitting. But the social part, you just have to plan on it taking time, and it means continual dialogue. I can't stress that enough, because otherwise we've heard today about not in my backyard, and the amount of criticals that are needed really requires that the EU and the US are also producing minerals, not just in other regions.
Yeah, Greg, could I jump in on that?
Please.
I think the spotlight that's being shown now on the need for these critical minerals for batteries and electric vehicles actually will help us and help society in general not allow backsliding. I think there's going to be more visibility on how mines are developed, how people operate, what standards do they operate to, are they accountable to whether it's a voluntary standard or it's regulation. So I'm optimistic that I do think we need to have some urgency around what we do, but I don't think it'll be backsliding. It'll be the Wild West and everybody will be out digging in their backyard for lithium or anything else. That it will be managed and regulated. I think there's a real opportunity there for more partnerships and more transparency. So I'm optimistic that the mining industry, we've been talking to ourselves for a very long time about how well we do some things, and here is an opportunity for us to demonstrate that we really do mean it, that we really are going to help communities develop, that we really are going to do local procurement, that we're going to develop skills as we go, transferable skills so that people will be able to get jobs once we leave. So I'm more optimistic that we'll be able to, use this focus and the need for what we do to create, even more responsible mining and more recognition for the role that we play in the value chain. We heard a lot today about the value chain, and, it wasn't too long ago that miners, only wanted to mine. And now everybody wants to get involved, not everybody. Many of us are looking at how we can be more integrated into the supply chain and make sure our customers really are getting what they need, and that we're working downstream as much as possible.
How much since there seems to be much more awareness societally of the importance of certain of these critical minerals, how much do consumers now drive the enforcement of social responsibility by mining companies?
I would actually say that consumers are incredibly interested in the EV supply chain.
Yeah.
We have really been kind of under the lens, much more so maybe than the previous, the oil and gas industry. And I think that's incredibly positive. I think that ties in with what Elaine said. We are the solution. And if you look at from the government side, of course, the EU is promulgating an EU battery passport, and that will include where a mineral has come from, and potentially even require adherence to certain responsible mining standards. And so, think about, you're going to go and buy that car, and your consumer is going to be able to see all that. And what we would love to do is, as part of that battery passport, also show the positive legacies we're creating, because we need to tell that story too. And so the jobs that are created, the hospitals, schools, whatever that are built through this process. It's really important to share that as well, because if you only look at the impacts but you don't look at the positive legacies, it's not a fair comparison. And we owe it to society that we're also sharing that information as well.
Greg, I have a slightly different, nuanced perspective on that. So for us, the way we look at the critical battery minerals, especially given that most of them are located on the continent, in places like Congo, DRC, you have 60% of the world's cobalt there, for example, and we are playing a significant role in developing that value chain in the Congo in partnership with other financial institutions like Afriex, Sibanye, and some other institutions to see how do we develop these resources in a responsible manner, because we know how it's been done in the DRC, for example, in Zambia as well. So our organization is taking a leading role in making sure that it's extracted in a responsible manner, but going one step further to not just extract these materials, but also process these materials on the continent, because that's where the real value will be done as opposed to exporting. So we're going out of the days of like the oil sector where you just export all these materials. But now, how do we make sure that the people on the continent benefit from the dividends of these critical minerals? As you see, if you look at the value chain, you talked about the value chain, most of these critical minerals are shipped to China and other places of the world. Well, we just did a study that shows that, in fact, if you can develop the battery precursor value chain on the continent, it's 50% cheaper than sending it to China. Why don't we develop that aspect so that it can benefit the people of the continent too? So we take it as the S can also be looked at in terms of beneficiation, value addition at least from an African perspective on the continent. That also provides and solidifies the S and the ESG conversation.
You all operate on just about every continent in the world. So is there one immutable, one core social value that you could identify for everyone that relates to this concept of the mining social contract?
Well, I think we all have a deep-seated commitment to the safety of our workers.
Yeah.
And to the mining industry is led for a long time in terms of the health and safety in the workplace. And That's certainly a big part of the S for all of us as we think about that and report that. So I think that is always common across any responsible mining company, and I think largely the top standards that which we would adhere to with regard to human rights and some of the other things are really quite consistent, and that it doesn't matter where you operate. We have the same standards in place whether you're in Australia or America or Ghana or anywhere else. The expectation is this is how we do business, and that's what we're going to do.
Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Please. No.
I just wanted to add to that. So for us, health and safety is just given, as well as the environmental protection. And we're looking at the development aspect on the top of that. How do we leave a better legacy after the project is done? And again, the S has a very, very prominent role in that, because at the end of the day, these companies exist because of the S. So we are providing the minerals for all of us to enjoy the life that we have, and we need to make sure that those lives for the people who are directly impacted are also improved. And not improved just for the period of time when we are there, but they have the skills, they have the ability to manage their lives and their livelihoods for a better once the mining company leaves that community.
I would agree with that. I mean, I would sum it up as positive legacy. And if you look at the IRMA standards, there's a whole pillar called positive legacy. And what is it that you're doing to ensure that your workers are safe, to provide those good jobs today, to ensure that once you leave, hopefully you've developed an ecosystem. And I think that's one of the exciting things about the EV supply chain, and you mentioned that as well, is we're looking at Kings Mountain, North Carolina. The mine site will have X amount of life, but in the meantime, we'll build a lithium hydroxide conversion facility fairly close by, and that will certainly continue to produce well beyond that. And in turn, we're seeing a real ecosystem of the EV supply chain forming around there. So our vision, shared vision for Kings Mountain is we borrow the resource for now, we return it, leave it in a better than when we began mining again, and then ensure that community members are prepared to really be fully employed in this really wonderful new ecosystem that we're developing around the world.
As a matter of public policy, we know that the governments are pretty good at devising environmental laws to deal with the releases of hazardous substances, down to the very micro, part per million or billion, right? That becomes an environmental event, and there's reporting requirements, there's pretty clear regulations. Can you legislate, can you pass a law that deals with the S effectively?
I mean, I think we have to. I think it's a huge shortfall right now because, again, it goes back to the same issue where all the regulations are still based on not polluting the river, not committing abuses. And there's a lot of legislation and the environmental impact assessment. I mean, even the ESIA, yes, it does say social. It's still heavily skewed towards the environment. And it is possible right now still in many countries to get a mine approved that doesn't have a very, very great plan socially to be economically developmental for the case. And that might be approved in the short term, but the long term is that the communities might not want that. So we do need to drastically change the regulations to incentivize and basically require different plans, local hiring plans, local procurement plans. Obviously, there are rules in the WTO against some of discrimination, but in terms of creative ways to make it so that companies do have to submit some kind of economic plan as part of their approval process, I think is the way to go. And we're already seeing that in the renewable space right now with all the new wind power in Britain right here. With those new local content requirements for Britain, you have to submit a local procurement plan for that. So I think we can do that with mining as well, even in advanced countries where you might think this would be automatic.
I don't think that we need to wait for legislation to come in place. At the moment, it takes about 20 years from discovery to operation. If you wait for a legislation to be passed away, we're not improving on the S. We're not improving on who we are. We are not an extractive industry. We're a development industry, and we need to find a way how to communicate that, how to articulate that in a way that people can understand. At the moment, if you look at it, our industry is at the bottom of societal sort of acceptance. We definitely have an issue that we need to resolve. And it's not a lack of communication. We need to look at in ourselves and change the narrative, change the way how we are talking about what we are doing, because what we are doing is basically helping this transition that we're all talking about. And no one wants to see it.
Yeah, I'd like to echo that, Greg. I think if we wait on laws and regulation, we waste too much time and we're far too late. Because the science always is ahead. The science or the social expectation is going to be ahead of the law and the regulation. So I think the industry has to hold itself to accountable to doing the right thing. And now we are seeing the pull more and more from the customer and the examination of what we're doing by the automobile industry, by the electric sector, which gets back to I wanted to make one comment that you asked about whether the consumer is going to reward us for what we're doing. I think we're seeing the pull from the Fords and the GMs and the Teslas and Apple, and they have strict standards and they require certain things of us. But will the consumer pay more for a vehicle that has been rigorously sourced back to the best copper, the best lithium, the best iron ore, the best production processes, the best human rights? How much more is a consumer going to be willing to pay for that? And are they even asked? And I think that's going to be a real test. And that's when the squeeze is going to come on the mining, on the upstream, as the Fords and the GMs try to make an economic electric vehicle with green materials, but they won't give us a premium for our product because they don't get a premium in the marketplace. So that's something that we have to watch and continue to ask for. That's where law and regulation and policy, government policy, may help address that.
You read my mind.
No, it's a very important point because in the last few weeks you can see some ESG funds have folded up, right, because of some of these issues. Right? Are the benefits being passed on to them and to their investors? It doesn't seem as if so there needs to be some sort of intervention. Maybe that's where the government comes into place. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, it's clear that the communications strategy is going to be integral to getting this word out, and Mines and Money is just one way of communicating the importance of these values. And it's been my pleasure and an honor to moderate this panel. So thank you all.
Would you like to take one or two questions from the floor if we do have?
If there are questions.
Yeah, just throw it.
Oh.
I wish I hadn't asked that. I'll go to yourself first, and then I'll go to this gentleman there.
Hi, thank you for a great discussion. Osam, it's a question to you. With regards to Africa, how to move the needle towards the just transition and energy transition in a more effective and transparent way there, and by building those ecosystems.
Sorry, what was the question?
How to apply that ecosystem approach in Africa, and how we can get finance for that in Africa?
Yeah, no, that's it's a $1 million question. I think that for us, it's going to take a critical mass of financiers like ourselves who are committed to the energy transition, but not just energy transition, but also development of the continent too, because there sometimes seems to be a conflict between trying to achieve this transition versus the developmental needs which are required for the continent in a number of ways, but trying to show that there is not a conflict between the two, right? Because, if you talk about things like power, for example, 50% of the continent doesn't have access to power. So how do you legislate that certain things which are required for the transition be put in place in a continent like Africa? So this is where you have to start showing that there is not necessarily a conflict between the two objectives, and that's where the tension really is, right? So how do you balance the two of them? Thank you.
Evening. Jonathan Molyneux, ERM. Thanks very much to the panel. One point and then a question. Just sympathising with the theme a few minutes ago, Elaine, I think it was you talking about the premium on green metals and all of the recognition and return on all of the effort it takes. And it just seems that these downstream brands that are building their brands for sustainability, the sophistication of society, there's a lag in the sophistication, and I think what makes it even harder for the recognition and return on the green metals is these brands are threatening to substitute quite a lot of the metals for recycled materials or even alternatives. So perhaps places that premium on even further out of reach. I don't know where you want to go with that thought. But the question I was keen to get a reaction from, particularly from the miners in the panel, was that I think it was last May, the ICMM released guidelines on socioeconomic reporting. And I wondered, I suppose we're still in the first year, and those guidelines are probably landing. But what's the experience so far, and what's the panel's view on, the value that's going to bring to reporting and giving visibility of these social issues we've been talking about?
You want to go first? I'll comment on your first comment, and then leave the socioeconomic standards to somebody else. But I think what we're seeing happen is more willingness on the mining sector to move downstream and be involved in recycling more than we used to. Didn't want to go anywhere near that, and now we recognize the importance of that. You can produce aluminum from recycled material for 10% of the electricity it takes to refine virgin aluminum, so you've got that. And also we are recognizing more and more that there's massive resources around in our waste. The things that we threw away yesterday, the tailings that are in huge impoundments all around the world, still contain lots of minerals. And as the value of those minerals goes up and our ability to extract those for distinct products, I think you're going to see the miners more and more engaged. And so it's not a threat, it's an opportunity for us to supply the world with what we need, with what they need in a more economic way.
That's right.
Perfect.
And Sibanye, Stillwater, one of the companies I'm on the board of, is very, very involved already in doing that recycling business, particularly in the U.S., we're the world's biggest recycler of used catalytic converters, for the platinum and palladium.
Yeah. Hugo, I want to ask the point.
Sure. So we're, in Albemarle, we're also, we don't see recycling as a threat, but rather as an opportunity. And the demand for lithium is going to grow so exponentially that recycling is a key solution to ensure that we can really maintain pace supply with that demand. On your ICMM question, we've been incredibly focused on the initiative of responsible mining assurance, and so I have to say I haven't read those socioeconomic standards. I will say, but I will. But through IRMA, there's a lot. It generates a lot of transparency. So our third-party audit will be published for the Solar either in December or January by IRMA, and the world will be able to see where we've got strengths and where we've got a journey still. And there's a huge emphasis on the social, on the S part, and so as well as transparency. So if you go onto our website in Spanish, you'll see how much we've paid in taxes, how much we paid in commission, how much we're providing to communities, and so I would probably, I'll have to look at those ICMM standards, but I suspect through our sustainability report, through the work that we've done to more transparently provide information at the site level. We're at a big multinational, and we usually we don't report that way, but we've done so based on these standards, as well as through the third-party audit that's been done. I would imagine that we're at least sharing that information, and probably more.
Just, if you allow me, quick reflection on sort of this willingness of the end user to pay. And we were looking at decommodifying our product, like gold, and whether we can label it green or conflict-free. And there is quite a lot of research right now that the end user is not willing to pay more, but they are willing to switch. Yeah. And this makes our life even more challenging because the end user is switching from one to another. So the question for us is not or, but it's and. So it needs to be responsibly sourced, it needs to be conflict-free, it needs to be forced label-free, it needs to all that because the end user is just moving from one to another without being willing to pay more.
Excellent. That's interesting.
Well, I think that's right. That kind of brings us to the end of an absolutely fantastic panel. So can we have a round of applause for the panelists, please? That just about brings us to the end of the first day. There are drinks now happening on the exhibition floor. Would invite you all to join us for drinks. And we'll be starting the same time again tomorrow morning at 8:30. Thank you very much for everyone's time.